thank you very much for inviting us here. We're delighted to be back in India. So this conference poses the premise that new, radical, paradoxical ideas change ways of thinking and doing things. We consider how bold new digital developments are forging new social, cultural, economic, communications, and technological modes and norms, new paradigms. First, we should appreciate that nothing is totally new. New ideas are always based on the transformation of what exists. How could it be otherwise? Consider the motor car, arguably one of the most radical, transformative, momentous technological inventions defining the 20th century. But look at the first cars. They resemble horse-drawn buggies and stagecoaches, but without the horses. One early vehicle even had a model of a horse mounted in front. The motor car had arrived, but people were psychologically and emotionally unwilling to relinquish what they knew from the past, that carriages were drawn by horses. When new technologies come along, it often takes a period of adjustment before they can be understood on their own terms. In the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution introduced a new material, cast iron. The first cast iron bridges had arches replicating the forms of the stone bridges that preceded them, rather than exploiting the structural capacity of cast iron to make new forms. Similarly, when architects began using new materials such as cast iron and plate glass, they turned initially to the Gothic and designed new buildings with retro-stylistic Gothic references. The new is often resisted. The new can sometimes be shocking, but invariably the new is an inversion or transformation of what already exists. Once its efficacy has been tested and proved, the new is accepted, absorbed, normalized. Then it shifts into being a paradigm, and we wait for the next transformation. In this digital era, we're presented with new technologies, new materials, new economics, new means of communications. A network society is implied by the instantaneous global interconnectedness made inevitable by rapid digital communications. Network society suggests also a new type of society, perhaps, even a more enlightened, informed, forward-looking society. But is this in fact likely? To the extent that we can command unimaginable amounts of data and marshal facts and information in quantities unknown in previous eras, and have at our fingertips the means to contact anyone, anywhere on the planet, the network society is a glorious construct. But it would be mistaken to conflate data and information, however speedily delivered, with wisdom and enlightenment. The network society is not so much new as turbocharged. Humans have always networked, sought to influence and persuade each other, worked and battled with each other. It's just that today we can use our powerful digital technology to do these things faster and smarter. Digital technology also facilitates and even causes significant problems. In the digitized network society, we see how dangerously wide discrepancies opened up between super high earners and those in poverty. Dangerously disparate opportunities offered to the privileged few at the expense of the excluded many. An emerging social order to match the network society should not benefit only the fortunate few. How is it possible or acceptable that 1% of the world's population holds 90% of the world's wealth? Surely we need different ethical political structures to mandate the fairer distribution of resources, be they data or money. Money should be equitably distributed because money pays taxes, it buys housing and consumer goods and services, and people find jobs. And that way our national economies keep ticking. Citizens have reasonable expectations that governments will provide infrastructure, transportation, communications, hospitals, schools, These things are hardly luxuries, but necessities. 100 and more years ago, the architectural profession had greater prestige and standing than it does today. And governments were actively building infrastructure, roads, railways, sanitation, low-cost workers' housing to replace slums. But today, the planning of huge infrastructure projects is not led by architects anymore, but rather by giant multinational contractors supported by developers. What is left for architects? They are given the housing blocks, the sports stadia, and the shopping centres to design. And everywhere they're compromised by contractors, developers, and their agents. There's an example on the outskirts of Delhi, where a new transport system is being built, and along its length is another version of office and apartment blocks that could be anywhere in China. No one has the power any longer to control the scale and magnitude of major development. Not politicians, not developers, not architects or planners. The scale is so immense that control defaults to the financial imperative to make money, and those power elites who will make the money hold the cards. Architects are deluded if they think they are instrumental in ways that 100 years ago architects could wield influence and propose urban visions. Architects today have little agency beyond superficial form giving. So a question, what can architects do? Well, perhaps quite a lot. Architects are appropriately trained to think, dream, envision, to project far beyond the norms and expectations of the societies they serve, and to sketch new notions for living and working. Architects today are among the leaders in tackling ways to deal with climate change, in repurposing and recycling materials, in proposing alternatives to the developer-driven McMansions and apartment towers. Architects are trained to think outside the box. Almost by definition, they are visionaries. We can't dictate how capitalism is to be reformed or how society is to change, but architects can act purposefully and sometimes subversively to bring about desired change as citizens, political activists, public intellectuals, and by making eloquent, poetic, paradoxical demonstrations to point the way towards future action. Now, this is not new. For the past 125 years, this is how architects have always worked. Historically, social activism in architecture has been cyclical. In the 1890s, there were the first attempts at town planning, social housing, and public health infrastructure. The revolutionary moments of the 1920s were another era of architectural social activism. And again during the reconstruction of post-war Europe. In the 1970s, many architects were at the forefront of the counterculture. And now too, in this new digital age, how will architects show the way? So now we'll turn to the 6 themes of the conference.
Okay, it's a tandem operation. The two of us have been working together for 50 years, and I get my turn now. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for the wonderfully warm welcome we all of us have received, but we particularly received. Thank you very much. Okay, now by modern architecture, we take it that what is meant here is in fact modernism. We find it curious that anyone would suggest, and I'm not suggesting that you would, that modernism is outmoded and not up to the challenge of providing the appropriate new architectural typologies, forms, and spirit for a changing society. The modernist project, the one begun in the early 20th century in opposition to historicity, the one with all its inherent potential for inventiveness, experimentation, rationality and poetics, that architectural project is alive and well and remains far from complete. I'll repeat, the modernist project is not exhausted. And furthermore, The modernist ethos is fully able to answer, excuse me, I must put these down, they're right in my face. The modernist project is fully able to answer the challenges of providing building types for the network society or any other kind of new society. We don't have to reinvent a new wheel. We already have all the necessary architectural means for typological, programmatic, formal, spatial, cultural and social invention at hand. To explain why modernism is not an outmoded architectural force, first we must take an historical perspective. To appreciate just how long a project as modernism might really take, consider the classical revival of the previous age. Classicism was a work in progress for 500 years. You're going backwards, Jack. That's it. And then we might... That'll do. Okay, you there? Okay. The trajectory can be traced from the early Renaissance as it segs into the late Renaissance and from there to Mannerism, followed by the Baroque, then Neoclassicism, before dissipating in the conflicting strands of the late 19th century eclecticism. When modernism is viewed in a similar context over a long period, postmodernism is no more than a momentary Mannerist revision, an early course correction in the long and far from exhausted arc of the modernist project. Without being guided by history, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking of contemporary architecture as so many successive styles, like fashion, each supplanting the one before. However, modernism is not a style per se, but a rational approach to architecture. Sibel Destoglu identifies the basic conceptual shift away from the classical revival architecture. Quote, making its heroic debut in the 1920s, the modernist discourse defines itself as the antithesis of the classic, an architecture of determination as opposed to one of composition, a method rather than a style, where form is to be derived from a rational analysis of functional, technical, structural and social criteria in response to a program, end quote. Modernism was to be an architecture of determination as opposed to one of composition, she said. So many current architects have apparently forgotten this central tenet of modern architecture and lapsed into empty compositional games of scenographic formalism. India, Australia, Mexico, France, China. These buildings are skin deep only, wallpaper architecture, stripped of the cheap facade systems, and inside their strange shapes, they're just like conventional multi-storey buildings of the last 30 or 40 years. So many floor slabs parcelled up with lightweight partitions into rectangular rooms. These facades hardly enclose a paradoxical new way of inhabiting interior space. Let's go back to history again to find out how modernism came into being. For centuries in the European world, just two building types, the palace and the temple, were adapted to the life and administration of city-states, principalities and kingdoms. However, with the centralised colonial empires and the Industrial Revolution came new and previously unimagined building programs, railway stations, hospitals, schools, warehouses, office buildings, prisons, factories. Finding appropriate architectural plans and forms for them was one of the great struggles of 19th century architectural thinking. For a time, Beaux-Arts planning worked, using circulation patterns based on symmetry and cross-axes. This resulted in building forms that extruded plans as symmetrical, balanced compositions. But new programs of increasing complexity and unprecedented individual requirements gradually forced architects to seek more flexible and ad hoc approach based on functional, that is rational, principles of planning buildings and composing their forms. The heroic modernist idea was that the design of each building must proceed anew with research, where Form is to be derived from a rational analysis of functional, technical, structural and social criteria. As Destoglu explains, this research was not just a matter of mechanically balancing competing criteria, but it was to be, in quote, response to a program, or as Le Corbusier put it, to make a plan is to determine and fix ideas. It is essential to have had ideas in order to furnish oneself with an intention. A plan contains an enormous quantity of ideas and the impulse of an intention. And we note here that the term intention and terms intention and program, and for that matter what we might say today design philosophy, they're all interchangeable. We need to appreciate the early heroic phase of the modernist project. We tend to aggregate the early heroic phase of the modernist project into a collection of styles. There's suprematist, futurist, constructivist, de style, rationalist, Bauhaus, expressionist, functionalist. But we should remember that directing each of these styles was a program, often in the form of a manifesto. And possibly the most memorable was Le Corbusier's 5 points towards a new architecture. Now, while stylistically varied, virtually all these arms of the modernism were motivated by a central ethical idea: to make an architecture in the service of the people. We are reminded of Hannes Meyer's reflections on his 2 years as the head of Bauhaus. Quote, "I taught the students to relate buildings to the community. I weaned them from the formalistic, intuitive approach and taught them to undertake basic research. I showed them how to put the needs of people first." Nearly a century later, have these central ethical ideas become any less relevant to the practice of architecture? Surely not. What we can add today to the ethical and programmatic propositions of the early modernists is our fresh, inventive response to the urgent environmental changes we face. In terms of materials and technologies, for instance, their sustainability and potential to be reused, recycled, developing passive climate control systems, and factoring in the longevity and durability of buildings to minimise embedded carbon footprints. These concerns all fall within the great remit of the modernist project. Remember, it's not about style. We think the intentions and objectives of modernism are far from exhausted.
So, wearing virtual reality goggles is not an alternative to accessing real public space in the future. People need tangible, experiential, authentic engagements with their surroundings and with other people. Not the dark isolation of the soul incubated in the voyeuristic, insular worlds of virtual reality. In India, public space is often the space of the market and a place of small traders, many small traders. It is also the place of chance encounters and social interchanges, the face-to-face networking in real time that builds connectedness in communities. Most modern public space results from laissez-faire urban consolidation or utilitarian town planning. In either case, community building interactions rarely drive design. In all cities, we see public space being commodified, the civic arena colonized by quasi-public commercial spaces, buildings, and programs. This assessment's pretty grim. However, there are positive signs in places where communities take back control of the aesthetic and environmental quality of their public spaces, led by activists and working through local government. There is a role here for architects, both as experts and visionaries. It is as visionaries that architects are trained as agents of change. There are many successful examples of this, but we'll focus here on 2 failed schemes, chosen because they offer 2 contrasting ways to envision the future. In 1976 and in 1982, competitions were held for the vacated La Villette cattle yards, the last large vacant public space in Paris. The first was an ideas competition in which Leon Krier proposed a new quartier and was awarded third prize. The second competition was for a new type of urban park for the 21st century, in which the entry by OMA, led by Rem Koolhaas, was awarded second prize. The winning scheme by Bernard Tschumi was built and is known for its red follies. Leon Creer's new Quartier de la Villette scheme proposed the model of the traditional 18th century European urban neighbourhood, where inhabitants lived within walking distance of work, shops, theatres, schools, parks, and places of worship. Most neighbourhoods could be crossed from end to end at a walking pace in about 10 minutes. The theses of his scheme were these. First, that the city should be reconstituted on the scale of the individual. The actual physical form of the city should be built up from a basic urban block no bigger than necessary to house about a dozen or so families. Second, there should be an end to zoning, and instead local communities would form cities within the city, each containing all the functions normal to the urban life of the city as a whole. And third, the various buildings that constitute the city, civic, commercial, industrial, residential, and so on, should be understood as types and made recognizably so. In the early 1980s, Creer tested some of these ideas at Seaside, a holiday village on the Gulf Coast of Florida. The OMA entry for the Parc de la Villette competition structures the park as parallel landscaped strips. Each strip is about 100 metres wide and has a different landscape experience: woods, open savanna, cornfields, lawn, flower beds, desert, alpine flora, and so on. Scattered across the site are large public buildings. There are two ways to walk through the park. One is an axial route, a formal promenade. The other meanders, a picturesque path that traditionally would present unexpected natural views. Here, Koolhaas adapts this meandering path to present unexpected views of the buildings and chance encounters with different types of landscape, such as breaking out of a field of wheat into a desert, or a forest glade, or a suburban garden. As you would expect, these are necessarily bald descriptions of a very complex propositions. But we selected these two schemes because they express two contrasting visions of how to approach designing for the future. Creer looks backwards to a time when European urban society, its culture and built forms, appeared stable and fixed. In his Quartier de la Villette scheme, he seeks to both update while simultaneously recreating that order, that sense of social and cultural stability, as if the future too can be held in stasis. Koolhaas, on the other hand, proposes a future of unpredictable indeterminacy, as he noted in the competition submission, quote, "It is safe to predict that during the life of the park, the program will undergo constant change and adjustment. The park will be in a perpetual state of revision. Its design, therefore, should be the proposition of a method that combines architectural specificity with programmatic indeterminacy. The underlying principle of programmatic indeterminacy as a basis for the formal concept allows any shift, modification, replacement, or substitute to occur without damaging the initial hypothesis," unquote.
The term vernacular was probably first applied in architecture by Bernard Radowski. In 1964, he wrote a book to accompany his exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and it was called Architecture Without Architects. The exhibition and the book presented examples from all over the world of what he called non-pedigreed architecture. He hoped these examples would become, quote, "the largest untapped source of architectural inspiration for industrial man." What Radowski saw as an opportunity, Paul Ricoeur saw as a problematic paradox. He wrote an essay in 1961 in which he observed, quote, "The phenomenon of universalisation constitutes a sort of subtle destruction of traditional cultures. The threat is expressed in the spreading before our eyes of a mediocre civilization. Everywhere throughout the world, one finds the same bad movie, the same slot machines, the same plastic or aluminium atrocities. Thus we come to the crucial problem confronting nations just rising from underdevelopment. In order to get onto the road towards modernisation, is it necessary to jettison the old cultural past? This is the paradox: how to become modern and return to sources, how to revive an old dormant civilization and take part in universal civilization. End quote. To transcend this paradox, in the 1970s, several architects turned to the vernacular. Hassan Fathi's Architecture for the Poor, published in 1973, described his experimental work using traditional Egyptian mud brick construction. Fathi's second book, published in 1986, Natural Energy and Vernacular Architecture, Principles and Examples with reference to hot arid climate, is still an essential handbook for many architects. In the late 1970s, Christopher Alexander and his team published research into vernacular architectures and the lessons for contemporary society, first in A Timeless Way of Building and in its really important sequel, A Pattern Language. At about the same time in Australia, Glenn Murcutt abandoned his stylistic adherence to the glazed sealed boxes of Mies, to whom he had served a phantom apprenticeship as a young student. He found they did not work in Australia's hot, humid climate and proposed instead a wholly modern architecture based on the Australian vernacular. Early British settlers in Australia built familiar Georgian houses and adapted them to the climate by adding verandas, something they had learned from living in India. Murcutt realised the cool and shaded veranda was the true living space of a vernacular Australian house. With the rational clarity of his functionalist training, he made his houses that were, in essence, all veranda. Murcutt's ideas for adapting the environment typologically and in constructional aspects of using typological and constructional aspects of traditional architecture were not developed in isolation. A handful of modern architects in Africa, in Northern California, in South America, in Japan, and here in India, also made buildings on these principles. However, it was Radisson, Fathi, and Alexander who first set out to theorise the application of the lessons from the vernacular. In the 1980s, when we were producing the national issues of our magazine International Architect, which dealt with regional identity, Kenneth Frampton was codifying the idea of critical regionalism. Frampton discounted architecture based on literary theory, semiotics, fractal geometry, or digitised dreaming, in favour of architecture as autonomous and self-referential. He wrote, quote, "The built invariably comes into existence out of the constantly evolving interplay of three converging vectors, the topos, the typos, and the tectonic. And while the tectonic does not necessarily favour any particular style, it does, in conjunction with site and type, serve to counter the present tendency of architecture to derive its legitimacy from other discourses," end quote. The substance of all vernacular architecture, topos, typos, and tectonics, forms the foundations on which the edifice of architectural theory, criticism, and practice could or should be erected. Topos deals with the local determinants associated with place, climate, and topography. Typology, the typos, is the architectural strategy for making building forms that are culturally connected to place, people, programs. The practice of tectonics raises to poetic expression the building materials and construction techniques that belong to a particular place and time. Frampton shows us how to synthesize the contradictory, paradoxical forces of a local past and a global future that Ricoeur identified. Frampton spells out how lessons of the vernacular are to be analysed, abstracted, and applied so that people's traditional cultural norms and their sense of place may be remembered, even reinforced, while they take their place in the modern world.
The steel frame, the curtain wall, and the Otis safety elevator, invented in 1852, removed the limits on the maximum height of buildings. Since then, the constant problem that engineers of tall buildings have had to confront is the twisting effect of wind-generated stresses. Working with Norman Foster, Arup's engineers addressed the problems of wind-generated live loads in the structural design of the 40-storey Swiss Ray Tower, nicknamed by Londoners the Gherkin. The triangulated structure effectively resists the twisting torsional stresses and any tendency for high-rise sway generated by wind-excited loads, live loads. The complex structural geometries required for buildings like the Gherkin require a complex form of computer analysis called parametric modelling. Marianne Freiberger, co-editor of the web-based mathematical science magazine PLUS, explains that, quote, parametric modelling has been around since the 1960s, but only now are architects and engineers fully exploiting its power. Parametric models allow designers to change a variety of features, parameters, while keeping fixed those features they have decided should not change. The models function a bit like spreadsheets. Changing a feature of the building is like changing an entry on a spreadsheet. In response to a change, the software regenerates the model so that predetermined relationships are maintained, just like when a spreadsheet recalculates all its entries. Equipped with these digital tools, a design team can explore a huge range of design options in a very short time. The results are buildings that would have been impossible only a few decades ago, both because of their complex shapes were next to impossible to conceive of or construct, and because of the degree to which they exploit science to interact optimally with their environment. That's all a quote. Parametric modelling has unleashed architectural form monstrosities every bit as atrocious as the worst historicist malapropisms of the postmodern period. That's an editorial aside. Still, parametric modelling can be a powerful tool in the interests of poetic yet rational design. Two examples. The architects of this office tower in Brisbane were presented with a site constrained by an existing basement car park that severely restricted where the building's foundations might be placed. Tristram Carfrae, Arup's design engineer for the project, knew that the lift cores would have to be located to one side, reducing their ability to resist lateral stresses. He was also aware of the way the triangulated perimeter structure of Foster's London Gherkin efficiently resisted wind loads while transferring dead loads, and he asked, could the perimeter columns be organized into a semi-triangulated lattice network pattern to compensate? And could they be gathered together towards the base of the building at a limited number of points to minimize their impact on the car park below? Looking at the gigantic banyan fig tree across from the site, Carfrae and the architects wondered, using parametric modelling, could they design an organic tree-like structure with a trunk and intertwining branches? Carfrae and his team developed engineering design rules in the form of algorithms. These algorithms would constrain the computer-generated parametric modelling of the fig tree structure within the predetermined structural, aesthetic, and buildable parameters. For example, to balance lateral stresses at each floor level, there was an algorithm to ensure there were as many columns leaning to the right as to the left. To suggest an organic appearance for the angle of the columns, other algorithms required that the lean between the floors be in successive increments of 250 millimeters. And to facilitate construction, there were algorithms to prevent individual columns changing direction between floors. To meet site constraints, this is the same architects, by the way, the Kurilpa pedestrian bridge needed to be lightweight and have a relatively thin deck. The design idea was based on using the concept of tensegrity to design a bridge with a deck so thin that it appears to defy structural logic. The elegant thing about tensegrity structures is that the two stresses, the pushing and the pulling forces, are separated out. A member is either in pure compression or pure tension. It is easy to identify which is which. Members in tension are cable-like and very thin. and the ones in compression are stick-like and relatively thick. Tensegrity structures can be light and structurally efficient, but have an inherent tendency to flex and move under live loads. Arup's lead design engineer, once again Tristram Carfrae, created a complex hybrid structure in which the deck support structure relies on the interaction of the three distinct structural systems, one being the tensegrity spars that provide lateral bracing. In a non-linear hybrid structure like the Kurilpa Bridge, stasis is achieved through the combined interaction of several hundred individual structural members, some in compression, many more in tension, each occupying different spatial coordinates and subject to different stresses generated by the dead loads and the constantly changing stresses of variable live loads. Even a slight variation in the length or angle of a single member will affect all the others, and potentially like the structural and functional integrity of the whole. Like Edward Lawrence's flap of a butterfly wings in Brazil, a small change can lead to a ripple effect through the whole system, with unpredictable, even catastrophic outcomes. That is, without the power of parametric modelling. Computational design paradigms in the service of two paradoxical design solutions.
During the late 18th century, the countryside and social economy of Britain were transformed by new industrial forms: steam engines, mechanised looms, iron bridges, ship canals, railways. These unprecedented machines and structures sparked the Industrial Revolution. It would later spread to Europe and the United States. By the beginning of the 20th century, as modernism was an emerging force, architects were relying on the new materials and technologies used for machines. Office buildings had reinforced concrete and steel frame structures, plate glass windows, lifts, pneumatic communications, mechanical heating and cooling, and the new electric lighting. Architects showed no fear of the new. Not only were they early adopters, they were also open to experimentation. Consider Frank Lloyd Wright's Larkin Building of 1903 in Buffalo, New York. The Larkin Company was a mail order business. To accommodate the hundreds of clerks, Wright developed a grand top-lit central atrium surrounded by floors of open-plan workstations. There are no enclosed offices apart from the meeting rooms. It would be another 60 years before these unorthodox ideas became a paradigm for office planning. Wright's experimentalism extended beyond the planning of the building. The corner towers accommodated the first air conditioning system. Wright's experimentalism was never exhausted. For his Unity Temple in Oak Park, he chose concrete. In 1904, this was a highly experimental decision. This was one of the earliest concrete buildings in America, and the first to express the nature of the material rather than conceal it. Wright's Imperial Hotel, built in Tokyo in 1915, was the earliest earthquake-proof reinforced concrete building in the world. Wright was his own engineer. The Johnson Wax Building of 1936, the central space was a vast open-lit plan. The glazed ceiling was held up by slender tapered concrete columns of Wright's own innovative engineering design. Here he's testing the loading for the local building officials. To achieve the diffused translucent lighting effect he required, he used Pyrex glass tubes laid in a bed of extruded sealant. This was cutting-edge industrialised American technology applied with poetic vision. In 1944, Wright's second Jacob House was built on the wide-open prairies where there was no shelter from the bitter cold winter winds. Wright built an earth berm on the exposed northern side and curved the plan into a deep arc around a sunken garden on the south to form a sheltered sun trap. He called it a solar hemicycle. It predates the first cold climate, environmentally sustainable designs by more than 30 years. The 1960s were marked by enthusiasm for technology throughout the industrialised world. A general interest in science and technology, coupled with a faith in the future, was the paradigm within which architects explored new ground, flexibility, mobility, expandability, and adaptability. These were key ideas. Architects appropriated industrial artefacts and components and assembled them out of their usual contexts. The epitome of this was the avant-garde design by Charles and Ray Eames for their own house at Santa Monica in 1949, conceived as a kit of parts taken from a catalogue of industrial building components. In 1961, Emsley Morgan designed a very large solar wall for the St George's School in Cheshire, England. So successful was the design that the backup heating system was dismantled, having not been used once during one of the worst winters on record. Now, Morgan, working in a scientific vacuum as far as low-impact environmental design was concerned, apparently accomplished his environmental masterpiece empirically. By the mid-1970s, experimental, energy-independent, sustainable housing was widely accepted among architects. And in 1976, Martin Spring and I edited an issue of AD on autonomous houses. In the 1960s, experimentalism extended beyond physical building, new materials or new technologies. In 1964, Cedric Price proposed his Potteries ThinkBelt project, a mobile university using a defunct railway network that connected pottery towns in the English Midlands. These few examples hardly scratch the surface. The history of the modernist project is one of unending architectural experimentation. The point we'd like to stress is that to be wary of the contemporary focus on the aesthetic possibilities offered by new materials and new technologies. Recent experiments in plastic formalism are visually seductive but tend to overshadow, even drown out, the more important experimental work to be done to lift living standards, address sustainability, build sense of community, and strengthen cultural connectedness to place.
So, both Haig and I had the privilege of being at the AA at possibly its most exciting moment. Sebastiano was also there. Alvin Boyarski was chairman, and he ran the school like like the ringmaster of a three-ring circus. This was not your ordinary architecture school with classes of students dutifully taking notes while being lectured by academic staff. There were no classes in the conventional sense. Every day was a series of events. The AA's weekly calendar was called the events list.
This is just one day.
Anyone could attend any event. There were no closed sessions. The word would get around that there was a hot studio crit going on somewhere, and the room would be packed with onlookers. By mid-morning, you'd find students up in the bar in deep and meaningful conversation with unit masters. In the afternoon, you might find Bernard Tschumi and Brian Eno, one of the founders of electronic music, running some experimental session in the soft room. Or down in the workshop, students crafting the multifaceted joints for a geodesic dome shelter for the homeless, or fitting out a double-decker bus for one of the studios to go touring in, or building the fully certified disabled lift they were in the process of installing in the AA. At the time, the AA had just enrolled a wheelchair-bound student. Almost every evening, the main lecture hall, just a big room, would fill up with students, architects, and friends of the AA to listen to the likes of Louis Kahn, Buckminster Fuller, Mario Botta, Bruce Goff, Peter Eisenman, or locals like Peter Cook, the Smithsons, Alan Cahoon, James Sterling, or Cedric Price in a pink shirt with a starched white collar, cigar in one hand and glass of brandy in the other. And remember, these were not big ticket events, just what happened 2 or 3 nights a week, every week. Any architect of note who flew through London in those days did a gig at the AA during their stopover. And not just architects, anthropologists, art historians, literary critics, scientists, engineers, philosophers, archaeologists. If anything really interesting was happening, the communications unit, which was where I worked, run by Dennis Crompton of Archigram, would be both making a video record and simultaneously broadcasting it around the school. The beginning of the academic year was chaos. In something of a stampede, students shopped around for a studio run by this unit master or that. There was a first year, the intermediate school, and the diploma school. Students were free to pick and choose their studios, or for that matter, be rejected by the unit master. They graduated from one level to the next on the strength of their design portfolios. Diplomas were awarded only after a technical project or portfolio was satisfactorily completed and their history theory thesis approved by, in those days, the formidable Dr. Robin Middleton. It was chaos, but highly creative chaos. While we were there, the AA's graduates included Rem Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid, Bernard Tschumi, Will Alsop, Ron Arad, David Chipperfield. Now, many attributed the success of the AA to its multitude of small studios, and this is certainly a factor. However, those studios depended on the caliber of the studio masters, which is all very well for the AA being located in central London at the crossroads of Europe, but not something easily emulated in more isolated regional corners of the world. However, far more instrumental in the AA's success was the way the school emphatically encouraged a culture of independent learning based on self-directed experimentation. It is a type of education that breeds visionary designers self-equipped to deal with whatever the future may hold. All schools, wherever they are located, could do this, but it needs to be supported by workshops with access to not only traditional building construction skills, but also new materials, the latest machines and technologies, workshops where students can get their hands on the tools needed to fabricate and test their ideas. We saw this work at the AA, and also recently as visiting professors, we've seen it at a small new school that is part of a private regional university in Australia. The Abedian School of Architecture has just 75 students. I think they'd like another 75. It runs a studio-based open learning program in conjunction with a fully equipped and professionally staffed workshop. As at the AA, students are examined on independently conceived and executed ideas, not their ability to regurgitate coursework rote learning. It makes you confident to know the future will be in the hands of students like these. I think that's the end. Thank you.